So many Samsung devices are receiving One UI across the globe, but is it better than iOS 12 or is it equal? Let's find out in this video. One UI versus iOS 12 coming up right now. Let's go. So what is up, guys? Nick here, helping you to master your technology, and welcome to the One UI versus iOS 12 XS Max on the right and Samsung S9 Plus for this example. This is not a comparison between those two devices, just showcasing the software. Now, let's talk about the first difference, and that is the control centers. These are pretty obviously different when you are using both devices. Some people said that they're similar. I don't find them similar at all. One thing I do want to note, to access the control center customization, you have to go to Settings, Control Center, and then you can customize your controls in iOS here in this list. So it is an extra step, whereas you can just hit this three-dot menu and go to the button order, and you can add things right here within the notification center. So Samsung makes that a little bit easier than iOS, as it's right there. However, some people might like the simplicity of iOS, how you don't have it there, no extra buttons, it just looks clean over here on the right. Now, it does seem like there's more things you can do in the control center on the Galaxy S9 for One UI versus over here on the right, but as you populate the little buttons here, it can get a lot larger here as well. Now, you can punch in like this to do different settings here on iOS. Over here, you can also do the same thing. If you click at the bottom, you can punch into different settings there. And you can see a much bigger clock right here. The clock is kind of gone when you pull down. Over here, no date up here, nothing like that. It's just your battery settings right there. So a little bit more information displayed in this notification center, and you can change things like flashlight brightness just as you would be able to do here on iOS. So a lot of different elements look different here. Also, one thing I do like about the Galaxy is that when you hit the Wi-Fi, it doesn't actually turn off here. Over here, it actually does turn off. So when you click that, it will turn off. Also, you can just click right here to get to your Wi-Fi settings. You can't do that on the iOS. You actually have to go into settings still to go get to your Wi-Fi and change things up. So it's a little bit easier on the Samsung to go ahead and get to things quickly. So that's basically the differences in the control center. You can make the Samsung a little bit simpler if you'd like, but overall I would say that it's really going to come down to preference. I think that the iOS one looks cleaner, but I think the Samsung one has definitely cleaned up even more than before and is more customizable. I also like how the brightness slider is very low, so you can get to it right away, which is probably one of the most accessed features in the notifications panels. Let's talk about navigation on One UI versus iOS 12, where you can see you have your Android buttons right here. A little bit different design from prior Samsung softwares. Now, if I swipe up over here in the notifications tray, you can see navigation bar settings right there. If you click this guy, you will see something a little bit different, and that is full screen gestures, which I just enabled. If I go to details, they do have gesture hints. You can turn these on or off once you get the hang of it. Off to the right here, you can go ahead and go into your multitasking tray. Then if you're in an application, let's go to services, for example. If I swipe back, it'll go backwards like a back button. And then right here, we'll go home. So that's basically how you navigate this guy. Now, you can also go ahead and at any time just re-enable them if you have an issue with those new gestures. I think this is a little more complex in the way iOS works because it gives you more options, but still, for people who want gestures, they got it. For people who want home buttons, they got it. So again, options. That's pretty much what you always get with a Samsung device. Now with Apple, it's just their classic gestures. You swipe up to go into them. Let's go into a clock, for example. Swipe away, and there you go. Now to go into your multitasking, let's go ahead and open up the camera. And then you can go like this to swipe off to the right and go through them. And that's basically it. There's not much to speak of. I find iOS's gestures definitely a little more smooth than iOS 12. And probably a little bit easier to get the hang of than the new gestures in One UI. However, you don't ever have to use them in One UI. If you like your Android buttons, they're still there. So one way that iOS and Samsung's One UI became very similar, mostly Samsung becoming similar to Apple here, is moving navigation elements off to the bottom. So if you hit the phone, you could see keypad, recents, contacts. This stuff used to be at the top, very directly opposite from iOS, where if you hit phone here, you have your recents, contacts, keypad, stuff at the bottom. So this is almost identical now, moving the elements down. I think Samsung does it in more applications, but still, you know, they've done it here. So very directly similar to Apple when it comes to that element of the software. So do keep that in mind. If you're picking one of these two in terms of a new phone, you're going to get a very similar experience when it comes to navigating at the bottom of your display. So another similarity I noticed here is these bold type font faces brought to the One UI versus iOS 12, which already kind of had this. So let's go into calendar. It is done differently, or not calendar. Let's go into settings here. You can see very bold at the top right in your face. iOS already had this very bold up in the top right in your face. Same goes with some other applications. For example, let's go to the gallery here and let's go to photos here, and you could see albums and pictures just very bold up there at the top. So that's a very close similarity, and you're going to see this in a lot of applications such as the clock for Samsung. I see like more bold stuff going on with the One UI than so much in the Apple, but Apple does it here in their App Store as well. So I think this was an inspiration from iOS 12, to be quite honest, seeing these bolder typefaces at the top of some applications. So I did want to point that out, but still it's very nice that it's easy to read on both of them now. So your choices are great, whether you go with Samsung or Apple. So discussing icon changes, there's some big ones to the One UI. A lot of things did change up. We're not going to go through everything, but you can see I have a bunch of Samsung apps here. It looks very different from before. Some people aren't liking this, but again, you still have the theme store. You can change your icons whenever you feel like it here for the Galaxies. The Apple icons are basically the same as they've been on iOS 12 and many versions before it. It's not that much different. So still standard iOS icons, not much has changed in the way here. But I did want to point out with One UI that you're getting massive differences in the icons, a lot different from the iOS experience over here. However, they do have a similar shape. I will point that out to iOS. So there's one advantage to iOS 12 as well. They do have 3D touch here. Over here, you do have like these little quick shortcuts here on One UI. So if I go ahead and click the clock, you can see add alarm right there. If I hit Samsung Notes, I can go ahead and do a couple of things. So I do kind of like the way it works on iOS a little bit better. It seems like there's more applications that do support that feature than the one on the Samsung, and more shortcuts for 3D touch, but you do get them on both. So the settings menu is vastly different and vastly similar in many ways. I find the Samsung one to be bigger, like the bubbles are just bigger and easier to probably find stuff. If you're a first time user, you're just swiping through, it's just easier to see versus a lot of options here right in your face on the iOS experience. However, both of them are very easy to find stuff simply by hitting search. One thing I will note is once you get the hang of iOS, you will know where everything is pretty simply. In terms of the Samsung software, once you get into stuff, sometimes it gets a little bit complex to find things because there's a lot of features within those bubbles. So I think they're not really that similar in the way they look. I think the Huawei software is more similar to the Apple one. This guy over here still has a white background with color icons. That's a little bit similar, but you see these lines right here, they're just smaller, just a little more square-like, where this is more bubble-like. So definitely a little bit different here in settings. Less going on for the Samsung, but once you get into the stuff, more going on. So both of them are pretty equal. It just kind of depends on which settings menu you prefer visually. So Samsung with One UI beats Apple to the punch with a system-wide dark mode. So if I go over here and put on the night mode, everything this looks beautiful in this darker color. If I go to the calculator, make some calculations at night, everything is dark. Settings, let me go to settings, everything gets dark. So everything just clean without having to download it. iPhone, you don't have a dedicated dark mode. You have something similar. It's like a smart invert mode. So if I triple click the home button, hit real quick, you can see things do look dark. If I go to settings, things are dark right here. So they got somewhat of a dark mode here on iOS, but it does like this weird contrasty thing right here. So it's definitely not the same as the one on the Samsung, which kind of just themes it out. So we might see a dark mode on iOS 13, but for now, Samsung does have the advantage when it comes to a dedicated dark mode. The one thing about the One UI I wanted to point out, you can have it with just a grid of icons by hitting the home settings and putting on home screen only, and then essentially you have an iOS experience over here with just the home screen. So if you want that, you can get that here for Samsung as well if you don't prefer having app drawers and have to find apps. So I just wanted to point that out for One UI versus just a grid of icons here for iOS, but you expect that when you do buy iOS 12 device over here. So when it comes to multitasking, One UI versus Apple, on Apple, it's just a gesture and then you have your swipe through sideways multitasking. Now, Samsung used to have it up and down, which I liked. They went to a sideways thing right here as well. They do give you one option over Apple. You do have yourself the recently used apps at the bottom. They do this on the iPad with iOS 12, but not on the iPhone. Also, if you go ahead and click up here at the top, you do have yourself the ability to go ahead and multitask if that app is available. So you can go to split screen, then you could search an application. Let's say I want to go to my calculator while I'm doing something else. They removed that option to switch apps around, so I don't really like that too much on One UI. Also, you do have pop view. So if I click this calculator, I can pop things like this. I can also make it transparent, and then I can move it around and use things, still see what's behind the screen. So lots of multitasking going on here still with the Galaxy device versus Apple's just simple app tray, which you go through applications one at a time. So the advantage definitely to Samsung here. So one advantage to the One UI as well is the one-handed mode. So if I swipe down, you can see I can go through these things like so, and essentially have a one-handed mode. Now you don't have anything like this for iOS, so keep that in mind. This is an advantage to the Samsung device. If you find your phone to be too big, you want to reach down at one hand. Now you do have reachability here for iOS 12, so if I swipe down, I can reach things simpler like that. That is kind of a one-handed mode, but not fully one-handed because it comes back up to a large size. You have to keep doing it over and over again, and sometimes you miss that little swipe down action. So when it comes to the keyboard differences, the One UI brings some new modes like the ability to change the size right here from the application itself. We have the new floating keyboard. So if I click this guy right here, the modes, I click floating keyboard, we can move this around anywhere on the screen. We also have our standard keyboard, and in modes, we have one-handed keyboard as well. You can move it off to the right or the left. Now, in addition, we do have ourselves the ability to go ahead and change the color of this keyboard as well. It does change with the night mode as well. So if I go to standard, I pop this thing into night mode, the keyboard turns into a black keyboard. So it's adaptive keyboard as well. And you have swipe on here right out the gate. Emojis, definitely probably better here for the iOS experience. Apple's always adding new emojis all the time, and I think many people just prefer the Apple emojis, myself included. They just look better to me than the Samsung emojis if you're into that thing. Apple is just a very basic standard keyboard, but one thing about the Apple keyboard that is really bar none is the autocorrect feature is just spot on. You could type without looking, and you could trust that keyboard is going to get it every time. So I find the keyboard still to be more accurate on iOS and the emojis to be better, but I find Samsung's more customizable and just more features, just kind of like the whole operating system. So managing your battery is different as well. In Samsung, it's just a list of your applications using whatever you're using. Battery usage gives you your screen time and stuff like that. Over here, you have a much more analytical breakdown of your battery on Apple. If we hit the low power mode, you have that right here. Samsung also has way more power modes, high performance, medium power saving. I find medium power saving to be probably the best balance of getting more battery, but also decent performance. It's probably similar to the low power mode here for Apple. If we go to battery health, you can see your battery health 100%. That's a nice touch you don't see on Samsung. I like to see some battery health there on that device. So overall, I just find Apple's to be a little bit more complex to understand. Using graphs is not the most simplest way to do things. I think a list view is a lot easier. Apple used to have it this way, but they got a little bit more in detailed after the battery problem. So for me, I prefer the Samsung way of doing a battery, but people might like this whole analytical breakdown thingy that's going on with iOS 12. When it comes to the camera software, if I click that camera icon, you can see that we do have photo modes, video modes, super slow-mo, hyperlapse, everything at the bottom elements like I talked about before, how they're moving that stuff down there. You can go ahead and pinch out this or pull this guy out right here. Let me get out of that mode. Pull out this little shutter key, and then you can have a little shutter key over there. You can hold down to burst. At the top, your settings menu is right there, flash, aspect ratios, and you know, all the features are just right there. So that's pretty nice. Now on the iPhone experience, you still have to go into settings to change settings, which is annoying still for the iPhone. I hope they change that in iOS 12. It just takes a little button to go to your settings. I don't know why they don't just do that. Time lapse, you do have slow-mo, video, photo, portrait, square, and pano. So in portrait, you can use the f-stop key to go ahead and change the apertures and bokehs and stage light, mono, and all that good stuff. So at the end of the day, it's still simple to use. You still have to go into your settings to change stuff. So it's really going to come down to which camera you prefer. Personally, I still prefer the Samsung one because you have the ability to get to your settings right there in the camera. Okay, so in terms of the smoothness, I still find iOS to be smoother than One UI. It just has better animation look to me. Even though the One UI is smoother than the past Android 8.0 I've seen, I think it's getting a lot closer, but Apple is still ahead here and just that smooth, refined feel. In my final conclusion, we basically covered most of everything I wanted to cover here between these two. Now on the lock screen, you do have the always on display here. I'm not going to show it, but you have that feature over Apple on the right. The software really is subjective. It's still going to come down to whether you want customization or reliability and software updates. The feature set is more minimalistic here than ever before for Samsung, but also still keeping those features hidden behind the scenes for those power users who still want to take advantage of them. But I think it's getting easier and easier for an everyday consumer to just pick up a Samsung and use it. It's getting easier than ever before in history. I'd pick iOS if I wanted a more reliable, just trusted experience where I don't have to think about anything. It's just kind of second nature using this device. So much so it kind of gets boring, to be honest. A lot of people get very bored of the iOS experience. If I wanted to have fun though, I think the Samsung experience is much more fun to use. That's it for me, One UI versus iOS 12. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments section of this video. Which do you prefer, the Samsung experience with One UI or iOS 12? Or are you just waiting for iOS 13? Let's talk about it. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thumbs up if you enjoyed this video. Nick here helping you to master your technology. Be sure to be well and peace.